The first time I noticed it, it was barely there, a faint, almost translucent smear on the pristine white wall of my living room, just above the skirting board, near the corner where the armchair usually sat. It was the kind of imperfection that only someone obsessively meticulous, someone who cleaned their apartment with the fervor of a religious ritual, would ever see. And I was that someone. I paused the vacuum, my breath held, staring at it. It wasn't dirt. It wasn't a scuff. It looked organic, like a dried, diluted drop of something dark, yet almost entirely transparent. Tentatively, I reached out a finger, hesitant, and touched it. Nothing. No residue, no texture. It was as if the faint discoloration was part of the wall itself, an internal bruise. I frowned, fetched a damp cloth, and scrubbed. It didn't budge, not one iota. I even applied a dab of bleach, which usually obliterated all sins from my surfaces. Still, it remained, a ghost of a mark. Self-reassuring. I told myself it was the light, a trick of the eye, perhaps a subtle discoloration in the paint that I'd never noticed. But I had. I lived in this apartment for 7 years. I knew every crack, every imperfection, every subtle shift in the light. This was new. Over the next few days, the stain subtly darkened. It wasn't a rapid change, nothing dramatic. It was like watching a bruise bloom on skin, slow and inevitable. From a translucent whisper, it became a pale gray, then a sickly beige, and it began to spread, infinitesimally, inch by agonizing inch. Not outward in a circle, but up, uneasy, a slender, creeping tendril reaching towards the ceiling. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the isolation of working from home had finally gotten to me. But every time I entered the living room, my eyes were drawn to it, a dark, magnetic north. I started rearranging furniture, pulling the armchair closer to the wall, hoping to hide it. It was a futile gesture. I knew it was there, and that was enough. Then came the smell. Faint at first, like damp earth after a long rain, but with an underlying sweetness, sickly and cloying, like rotting fruit or old flowers. It was almost imperceptible unless you specifically searched for it. Inhaling deeply near the wall. I opened windows, lit scented candles, ran the air purifier on high. The smell persisted, a low hum beneath the pleasant scents. It was strongest near the stain. I called my landlord, vaguely describing a damp issue. He sent a handyman, a gruff man who shone a flashlight on the wall, tapped it, sniffed indifferently, and declared it dry as a bone. He looked at me like I was insane when I insisted. There was a smell, a new smell. He suggested I air out the apartment more. I nodded, feigning understanding, and ushered him out, the smell lingering in his wake like a judgment. The stain was now the size of a dinner plate, an amorphous, blotchy mass of dark gray and deep, unhealthy green. It had sent out several thin, spider-like tendrils, some reaching almost a foot up the wall. The scent, too, had grown, now a constant companion, thick and earthy, mingled with that unsettling sweetness. It permeated everything. My clothes, my hair, even my food tasted faintly of it. I started sleeping less. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, convinced I could hear a faint, almost imperceptible creaking from the living room. A slow, organic settling sound. Or maybe it was a stretching. My imagination, I told myself. Just my overactive imagination. One morning I woke to find a small, dark beetle crawling on my pillow. I jolted upright, a strangled cry catching in my throat. I hated insects, but this wasn't just any beetle. It was unlike any I'd ever seen, a mottled, segmented creature, almost black, with iridescent green flecks on its shell. It moved slowly, deliberately, its antennae twitching. I swatted it with a book, feeling a perverse satisfaction as its shell crunched under the impact. But then I saw another. And another. Small, dark shapes scuttling across the bedroom floor, emerging from under the door, from the gaps in the floorboards. They were all the same species, all mottled green and black, all moving with that slow, deliberate purpose. And they were all heading in one direction, towards the living room. I followed them, my heart thumping against my ribs. The living room was bathed in the sickly gray light of dawn, and the air was thick with the scent. The stain had grown exponentially overnight. It was no longer just a stain. It was a mass, a raised, pulsating growth on the wall, dark and glistening, like a vast, malignant fungus. Its tendrils now snaked across the entire lower half of the wall, reaching towards the ceiling, towards the door frame. It looked like muscle fiber or some dark, arterial network. And from small, newly formed fissures in its surface, the beetles were emerging, hundreds of them, thousands. They poured out, a silent, chitinous tide, covering the floor, crawling over the furniture, drawn to some unseen purpose. I backed away slowly, my breath shallow. This wasn't a damp issue. This wasn't a mold problem. This was alive. It was growing, breeding, taking over my home. I stumbled back into the bedroom, my mind racing. I needed to get out. I needed to call someone. The police? An exterminator? What would I even say? There's a sentient wall fungus spawning beetles in my apartment. My phone, lying on the nightstand, felt impossibly heavy. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. As I did, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the dark, unlit screen, and I screamed. Not at the stain, not at the beetles, at myself. My face was pale, almost translucent, like the stain had been at first. My eyes were wide and bloodshot, but beneath them, a faint, almost imperceptible, grayish-green bruise was blooming on my skin. And from the corner of my mouth, a tiny dark tendril, impossibly thin, was beginning to emerge, just visible to the naked eye. It was reaching, ever so slowly, toward... The beetles in the living room were no longer moving towards the stain. They were turning, and they were coming for me. They moved with that slow, deliberate purpose, a dark, segmented wave. I dropped the phone. It clattered to the floor, the screen cracking. I backed into the corner of the room, pressing myself against the wall, but the wall felt soft, spongy, and I could feel it then, a faint, almost imperceptible pressure beneath my skin, a stretching, a slow, organic settling, a feeling like something was rooting and blooming inside me. The tendril from my mouth was now a little longer, a little darker, a little more defined. I could feel a dull ache spreading behind my eyes, a faint sweetness on my tongue. The last thing I saw before the darkness fully enveloped the room, before the beetles swarmed over my feet and began their slow, inevitable ascent, was the growing, pulsating mass on the living room wall. It wasn't just consuming the apartment. It was becoming it. And I realized with a chilling clarity that stole my breath, was becoming part of it too. The old man in the antique shop, smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and dust, had given me a look I couldn't quite decipher when I picked up the leather-bound journal. "That one," he'd rasped, his eyes narrow, "has a certain ominous history." He didn't elaborate, just shrugged and took my money. A little too quickly, I thought. I dismissed it as typical old man eccentricities. I was wrong. The journal itself was unremarkable at first glance. Aged, the leather worn smooth in places, the pages brittle and yellowed. It seemed to be a commonplace book, filled with eclectic entries, botanical sketches, snippets of poetry, mundane observations about weather, recipes for forgotten tonics. It was the script that caught my eye. A looping, elegant hand, sometimes meticulous, sometimes frantic, as if the writer had been seized by an idea mid-sentence. I brought it home to my cramped apartment, a sanctuary of peace after the relentless bustle of the city. I set it on my desk, intending to transcribe some of the more interesting entries later. That night, I fell asleep to the drone of city traffic and the distant murmur of my neighbor's television. The first whisper came a few nights later. I was half asleep, drifting in that liminal space between dreams and waking. It was so faint, like a breath against my ear, a rustle of dry leaves. I jolted awake, heart pounding. My apartment was silent, save for the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator. I dismissed it as a dream, a phantom sound. It happened again and again. Always at the edge of sleep, always a whisper, a delicate, almost inaudible sound that seemed to emanate from the direction of my desk. I started to dread going to bed. I'd lie awake, staring into the darkness, straining to hear, yet terrified of what I might hear. One particularly restless night, I decided to confront it. I switched on my desk lamp, its beam cutting through the gloom. The journal lay there, innocent, aged, and silent. I picked it up, my fingers tracing the worn cover. As I did, a distinct, brittle rustle emanated from its pages, and then, clearer than before, a whisper. It was too quick, too faint, to make out words. But it was there, a dry, papery whisper, like someone murmuring secrets just beyond comprehension. My blood ran cold. I started experimenting. I'd leave the journal open to a random page, or closed. It was a sketch of a flower, intricately drawn, but unlike any flower I'd ever seen. It had too many petals, or too few, arranged in a disturbing, asymmetrical pattern. Beneath it, in that looping script, was a single cryptic phrase: "The bloom of forgotten thoughts." As I read it, the whisper intensified. It wasn't a murmur anymore. It was a distinct, multi-layered chorus of sounds, dry and papery, like 1,000 brittle leaves skittering across a vast empty floor. And woven into that chorus, I began to distinguish individual sounds. A low moan, a sharp gasp, a choked sob. These weren't just whispers. They were echoes of something. I started to feel observed, not by human eyes, but by something ancient and pervasive. The air in my apartment felt thicker, heavier. Shadows seemed to deepen, to coalesce in the corners of my vision. I felt a pervasive coldness, even when the heating was on. I tried to get rid of the journal. I put it in a box, then in a sealed plastic bag, then shoved it to the back of my closet, under a pile of old blankets. It didn't matter. The whispers still came, slightly muffled but persistent, a gnawing presence. I started to hear them even when I was out, in the subway, in the grocery store. They were in my head. One night, I woke to a distinct, almost desperate scratching sound coming from the closet. It wasn't loud, just a persistent, rhythmic scritch, scritch, scritch. I knew what it was. The journal. Trying to get out. I crept to the closet, my heart hammering. I slowly pulled open the door. The box was lying askew, the plastic bag ripped open. The journal was half out, its worn leather cover seeming to gasp for air. And from its pages, a cacophony of whispers erupted. Not just moans and sobs, but distorted, fragmented words. Remember, lost, cannot, escape. The archive is vast. The words were broken, like transmissions through static, but their meaning was clear. This wasn't just a journal. It was a repository, a vessel, and whatever it contained, it was suffering. Or perhaps it was hungry. I pulled the journal out, shaking. Its pages seemed to ripple, almost imperceptibly, like a pool of dark water. The scent of dust and old paper was overwhelming, but underneath it, there was a faint, metallic tang, like old blood. As I held it, a new kind of whisper emerged. I felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to write, to confess, to pour out every secret, every dark thought, every moment of fear and regret I had ever experienced onto its waiting pages. My hand trembled, reaching for a pen. It felt like the most natural thing in the world. The only thing that would quiet the insistent, growing chorus of voices in my head, now screaming for release. As I picked up the pen, my fingers brushed against the cover. The leather felt warm, almost hot, and a faint vibration ran through it, like a pulse. I glanced down at my hand. My fingertips, where they touched the leather, were starting to turn a faint, sickly yellow, like aged paper. My skin felt dry, papery, and brittle. The whispers intensified. No longer just from the journal, but from the very air around me, from the walls, from the floor. They were everywhere. A vast, echoing chamber of suffering. Write, everything. Join us. I knew then what had happened to the original owner, the one with the elegant script. They hadn't just written in the journal. They had become part of it. Their thoughts, their memories, their very essence were now part of that eternal, whispering archive. I gripped the pen, fighting the overwhelming urge to start writing. But my hand moved involuntarily, hovering over the blank page. My mind felt like it was being drained, pulled, emptied into a vast, gaping maw. Memories flashed before my eyes. Childhood fears, forgotten slights, every fleeting moment of despair. They were being siphoned away, not forgotten, but transferred. My reflection in the darkened window showed a face growing paler, older, the skin tightening, becoming translucent. My eyes, once bright, were dull and hollow, like ancient, forgotten buttons. The whispers were now a deafening roar, a symphony of tormented souls demanding entry. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that soon I would be one of them. My voice, my thoughts, my very being would be added to the endless, dry, papery chorus within the whispering archive. And someone else, one day, would pick up the worn leather journal, and they would hear me. They would hear us, and then they would begin to write. The old abandoned orphanage stood on the hill overlooking the town, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised twilight sky. Locals whispered about it, tales of neglect and shadows, but never anything truly malicious. Just a sad, forgotten place. My documentary crew and I, armed with cameras, recording equipment, and a healthy dose of urban explorer bravado, were convinced it was ripe for a compelling, if melancholic, story. We were wrong. We spent the first day mapping the layout, setting up motion sensors, and leaving discrete audio recorders in various rooms. The silence inside was profound, broken only by the scurry of mice and the drip of unseen water. It was a silence that felt heavy, pregnant with unspoken history. As dusk settled, a chill permeated the air, not just from the dropping temperature, but something else. A pervasive sadness that seemed to cling to the crumbling plaster and splintered wood. We left, promising to return at dawn. The next morning, reviewing the audio logs, we found nothing remarkable. The creaks and groans of an old building, the occasional rustle, until we got to the recording from the old nursery. It started subtly, a barely audible hum beneath the static. My audio engineer, Liam, leaned closer, adjusting the volume. Wait, is that music? It was. Faint, ethereal, and utterly chilling. A lullaby. Not a sweet, comforting melody, but one imbued with an aching sorrow, sung in a voice that sounded impossibly distant, yet terribly near. It was a simple tune, repetitive, haunting. And then, woven into the melody, something else. A faint thump, 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 like a very, very slow heartbeat. We listened, mesmerized, for nearly 5 minutes. The lullaby continued, unwavering, the faint thumping a macabre accompaniment. The recorder had been left in the center of the empty nursery, a desolate room with peeling wallpaper adorned with faded images of whimsical animals. No one had been in the building during the night. Impossible. It's a trick of the recording. Interference. But Liam shook his head, his face pale. No interference I've ever heard. It's clean. It was there. We decided to go back immediately. And this time, we brought more sensitive equipment. We set up an array of directional microphones, infrared cameras, and even a thermal imager. We decided to spend the night there, a decision we would come to regret with every fiber of our being. The moment we stepped back into the orphanage, the air felt different, colder. The profound silence was gone, replaced by a subtle, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to vibrate in my bones. We returned to the nursery. As soon as we crossed the threshold, the hum intensified. And then we heard it. Faintly at first, then growing stronger, clearer, until it filled the room with an oppressive, heart-breaking presence. The lullaby. It was exactly as it had been on the recording, sung by that impossibly distant, sorrowful voice. And the slow, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, resonating within the very walls. Sarah, normally unflappable, clutched her camera. Liam stood frozen, his eyes wide. I felt a cold dread seep into my stomach, a primal fear that had nothing to do with ghosts or ghouls, but was something far more ancient and sorrowful. We tried to locate the source. We swept the thermal imager across the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Nothing. No heat signature, no anomaly. The directional microphones only confirmed what we already knew. The sound was ubiquitous in the room. As the night wore on, the lullaby became our tormentor. It was relentless, never stopping, never wavering. It began to fray at the edges of our sanity. We tried to talk, to rationalize, but our voices felt thin and hollow against the oppressive weight of the sound. The lullaby seemed to twist the very air, making it difficult to breathe, pressing down on our chests. Then, things started to appear. Not physical objects, but impressions. Fleeting shadows darker than the gloom, flitting in our peripheral vision. The distinct impression of small, skeletal hands reaching out from the corners of the room. The scent of stale milk and antiseptic. And the laughter. Not human laughter, but a dry, rattling sound, like brittle bones clacking together, high-pitched and cruel. It was always in the pauses between the lullaby's verses, a mocking echo. Liam, who had been meticulously monitoring the sound levels, suddenly, "The thump," he whispered, pointing at his screen. It's getting louder and faster." Indeed, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump was accelerating, the beats drawing closer together, morphing from a slow, mournful heartbeat into a frantic, panicked drum. The lullaby, however, remained at the same sorrowful, Then a small wooden rocking horse, positioned in the center of the room since we'd arrived, began to rock. Slowly at first, then faster and faster, creaking rhythmically in sync with the accelerating thump. Its painted eyes, faded and chipped, seemed to stare directly at us. Sarah screamed. A raw, guttural sound that was immediately swallowed by the intensified She stumbled back, tripping over a discarded toy, her camera clattering to the floor. As she lay there, something emerged from the shadows beneath the rocking horse. Not a distinct shape, but a ripple in the air, a colder, darker void in the gloom. It moved towards Sarah, impossibly slow, yet inexorable. And from it, a new sound emanated. A child's, desperate, suffocated Liam, his face a mask of terror, grabbed my arm. "We have to go, now!" We fled. We didn't grab our equipment, didn't look back. We ran blindly through the decaying halls, the pursuing us, amplifying, filling every crevice of the building, every corner of our minds. The thumping was a frantic, thunderous drum against our eardrums. The dry was all around us. We burst out into the pre-dawn chill. For breath, stumbling down the hill. We didn't stop until we reached our car, parked a quarter-mile away. We scrambled inside, locking the doors, and drove away, leaving the orphanage and whatever unspeakable horror resided within behind us. It's been months. We never went back for the equipment. We abandoned the documentary. The footage we did manage to capture deemed unwatchable, infused with an unseen terror. But it never left us. At night, when the house is quiet and the world outside falls silent, I hear it. Faintly at first, then growing clearer. That endless, heart-rending tune, and underneath it, the rhythmic, accelerating thump, thump, thump. Liam hears it too. He called me last week. He said the rocking horse in his daughter's room started moving on its own. And he hears the laughter now, dry and rattling, just at the edge of his hearing. Sarah. We haven't heard from Sarah in a week. Her phone goes straight to voicemail. Her apartment is dark. Sometimes when I'm alone, I feel a cold breath on my neck. I'm awfully thank, and the faintest impression of small